The Watchmaker's Dilemma. Chapter 1. The Ticking. Emil Brenner lived alone in a quiet part of Lausanne, in a narrow stone house with a small workshop at the back. The workshop was filled with shelves, drawers, and tables covered in tiny gears, polished brass plates, and glass tubes. The air always smelled of oil and metal. The ticking of clocks echoed through the room like a heartbeat. Emil had spent most of his life surrounded by machines. He didn't care much for company. He found comfort in the steady rhythm of time, in the way each part fit perfectly into the next. He was a watchmaker, and not just any watchmaker. He was one of the best in Switzerland. His clocks were famous in the city. People came from far away to buy them. They didn't just tell time. Some showed the weather with tiny moving clouds. Others tracked the moon and stars. One clock even changed color depending on the mood of the person standing near it. Emil had built it using a mix of steam pressure and a small sensor that reacted to body heat. He never explained how it worked. He liked mystery. He liked silence. He liked control. But deep inside, Emil wanted more. He didn't just want to measure time. He wanted to touch it, to bend it, to change it. He had thought about this for years. What if he could go back just a few seconds? What if he could undo a mistake, a word, a movement? Not hours or days, just moments. Enough to fix something small before it became something big. He didn't want to change history. He wanted to change regret. He worked on the idea in secret. He read old books, studied strange machines, and tested hundreds of designs. He built tiny engines powered by steam and magnets. He used rare metals and fragile crystals. He failed many times. But he didn't stop. He believed that time was not just a line, it was a loop, a pattern, like the gears in a clock. If he could find the right rhythm, maybe he could rewind it. After many years, Emil finally built something that worked. It was a small pocket watch, no bigger than his palm. It looked simple on the outside, with a brass case and a clear glass cover. But inside, it was different. It had a hidden dial that could be turned backward. When used, it would rewind time by exactly 30 seconds. No more, no less. Emil called it the Retronic. He tested it carefully. He dropped a spoon on the floor, turned the dial, and the spoon was back on the table. He knocked over a bottle of ink, turned the dial, and the bottle stood upright again. It worked. It really worked. Emil felt a strange mix of joy and fear. He had done something impossible. He had touched time. But he didn't tell anyone. He kept the Retronic in a locked drawer. He used it only when he was alone. He didn't want fame. He didn't want questions. He wanted control. He believed that if he used it wisely, he could live a perfect life. No mistakes. No regrets. Just clean, smooth time. Still, something felt strange. After each use, Emil noticed small changes. A clock on the wall ticked faster than before. A bird outside flew in the wrong direction. His own reflection in the mirror blinked a moment too late. These were small things, easy to ignore. But Emil didn't ignore them. He watched. He listened. He wondered. The ticking in his workshop continued, steady and strong. But now, it felt different. It was no longer just the sound of time passing. It was the sound of something else. Something new. Something waiting. Emile had built the Retronic to fix small mistakes. But time, he began to realize, was not a machine. It was not a tool. It was something alive. And he had just touched it. Chapter 2. The First Fix. Emile Brenner sat at his workbench, staring at the Retronic. The small brass pocket watch looked harmless, even elegant. Its surface was smooth, its dial finely engraved. But Emile knew it was more than a watch. It was a tool that could bend time, even if only for 30 seconds. He had built it with care, testing every gear and spring, making sure it worked perfectly. Now that it was finished, he felt both proud and nervous. He had created something powerful, something no one else had ever seen. But he didn't know what it would do to the world, or to him. He decided to test it in simple ways. One morning, while making tea, he dropped a porcelain cup. It shattered on the floor. Emile picked up the Retronic, turned the hidden dial backward, and watched as the cup returned to the table, whole again. The tea was still hot, the moment untouched. Emile smiled. It had worked. He had reversed time, just a little. It felt like magic, but it was real. He began to use the device more often, always for small things. A spilled bottle of ink, a broken gear, a missed step on the stairs. Each time, he turned the dial, and the mistake was gone. One day, a customer came into the shop and asked for a repair. Emile was tired and distracted. He said something rude, something he regretted immediately. The customer frowned and walked away. Emile reached for the Retronic, turned the dial, and the moment rewound. The customer stood at the door again, smiling, and Emile greeted him kindly. The conversation went well. The man left happy. Emile felt relief. He had erased the mistake. He had fixed the moment. He began to think that with the Retronic, he could live without regret. Every wrong word, every clumsy move, every small failure, he could undo them all. But soon, Emile noticed strange things. The wall clock in his workshop began to tick faster than usual. It gained several minutes each day, even though he had built it himself and knew it was accurate. He adjusted it, but the problem returned. Outside, birds flew in odd patterns. They circled the house, sometimes flying backward, sometimes disappearing behind trees and reappearing too quickly. Emile watched them from the window, confused. He checked his own reflection in the mirror and saw something even stranger. His reflection blinked a second after he did. It was small, but it was wrong. It felt like the mirror was remembering a different version of him. He tried to ignore these signs. He told himself they were coincidences, tricks of the mind. But deep down, he knew they were connected to the Retronic. Each time he used it, something changed. Not just the moment he fixed, but something around it. Time was not a simple line. It was a web, and every touch made it tremble. Emile began to write notes in a small journal, recording each use of the device and the strange effects that followed. He hoped to find a pattern, a rule, something that would explain what was happening. But the notes only showed more confusion. He started to feel uneasy. The Retronic was supposed to help him, to make life smoother. But now, he wasn't sure. He wondered if the device was doing more than rewinding time. Maybe it was rewriting it. Maybe each fix created a new version of the world, slightly different from the last. Emil looked at his hands, at the tools on his bench, at the clocks on the wall. Were they the same as before? Was he the same? He couldn't be sure. The changes were small, but they added up. The world felt thinner, less stable, like a painting with too many layers. Still, Emil continued to use the Retronic. He couldn't stop. The temptation was too strong. He wanted to live without mistakes, without pain. He wanted control. But each time he turned the dial, he felt a little more distant from the world. The ticking in his workshop grew louder, sharper, like a warning. Emil listened, but he didn't understand. He had built the Retronic to fix small things. But time, he was beginning to learn, had its own rules. And it didn't like to be changed. Chapter 3. Fixing the Past. Emil Brenner sat at his desk, staring at the Retronic. The ticking of the clocks around him filled the room, but his thoughts were louder. He had used the device many times now, always for small things. A dropped tool, a spilled drink, a wrong word. Each time, he had turned the dial and erased the moment. It had become a habit, something he did without thinking. But now, he was thinking. He was thinking about something bigger. Something that had stayed with him for years. His brother Leon had once been his closest friend. They had grown up together, worked together, and shared everything. But one day, they argued. Emil didn't even remember what started it. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was stress. Harsh words were spoken, and Leon walked out of the workshop. Emil expected him to return the next day, but he never did. They hadn't spoken since. That silence had lasted for years, and Emil felt it every day. It was the one thing he couldn't fix with gears or springs. Until now. He held the Retronic in his hand and thought about that day. He remembered the moment Leon turned away, the look in his eyes, the sound of the door closing. Emil had replayed it in his mind many times, wishing he had said something different. Now, he had the chance. He turned the dial and felt the familiar pull. The world shifted, and he was back in the workshop, standing beside Leon. The air was tense, but Emil spoke calmly. He chose his words with care. He didn't argue. He listened. Leon paused, then smiled. The fight never happened. They shook hands and went back to work. Emil returned to the present feeling lighter. He had fixed it. The pain was gone. He had changed the past, and it felt good. But the feeling didn't last. The next morning, he received a letter. Leon had been in an accident. He had fallen from a ladder while repairing a roof. Emil was shocked. That accident had never happened before. In the original timeline, Leon had never worked on roofs. He had stayed in the city, working in a shop. But now, something was different. Emil had changed the moment, and the future had changed with it. He sat in silence, holding the letter. His hands trembled. He realized that the Retronic didn't just erase mistakes, it rewrote reality. Every change created a new path, and that path had its own consequences. Emil had wanted to fix one moment, but he had opened a door to something bigger. He thought about the birds flying in strange patterns, the clocks ticking too fast, the reflection blinking late. It all made sense now. Time was not a simple line. It was a web, and every touch sent ripples through it. Emile began to fear his invention. He had built the Retronic to help, to make life smoother. But now he saw the danger. Time was not meant to be changed. It was delicate, alive, and full of hidden connections. He wondered how many versions of reality he had already created. How many small changes had led to big ones? How many people had been affected without knowing why? He stopped using the Retronic for a while. He locked it in a drawer and tried to forget it. But the ticking continued. The clocks in his workshop seemed louder, sharper. The shadows in the room felt longer. Emile knew that time remembered. It didn't forget the changes. It carried them forward, quietly and visibly. And he had become part of that flow. He looked at the letter again and thought about Leon. He didn't know if the accident was serious. He didn't know if he had made things better or worse. But he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't control time. He could touch it, bend it, even rewind it. But he couldn't predict it. And that made the Retronic more dangerous than he had ever imagined. Chapter 4. The Chain Reaction. Emile Brenner sat in his workshop, surrounded by ticking clocks and scattered tools, but the sound that once brought him peace now felt sharp and restless. The Retronic lay on the table, its brass surface polished and innocent-looking, but Emile knew better. He had used it again, hoping to undo the accident that had hurt his brother. He had turned the dial carefully, thinking he could fix the damage without causing more. But the world around him had started to change in ways he could not explain. The first sign came when a customer entered the shop asking for a clock Emile didn't remember making. It was a strange design, with symbols Emile had never used in a mechanism he didn't recognize. The man insisted Emile had built it last month, even described the day he had picked it up. Emile smiled politely, but inside he felt cold. He checked his records, but there was no mention of the clock. He searched his shelves and found nothing. The customer left confused, and Emile stood alone, wondering if the man had come from a version of time Emile hadn't lived. Then the newspapers began to change. One morning, Emile read about a fire in the city square. The article described the damage, the people involved, and even quoted a witness. But Emile had walked through the square that same morning. There was no fire. The buildings were fine. The people were calm. He asked others, but some remembered the fire and some didn't. It was as if the event had happened in one version of reality but not in another. Emile felt dizzy. He realized that time was no longer stable. It was splitting, bending, and folding in on itself. He tried to stop using the Retronic, but the damage had already begun. Each time he had turned the dial, he had created a new thread in the web of time. These threads were now crossing, tangling, and pulling against each other. People in town acted strangely. Some forgot things they had just said. Others repeated conversations as if they were stuck in a loop. A child asked Emile why the sun had risen twice that morning. Emile didn't know what to say. He had built the Retronic to fix small mistakes, but now the world itself was becoming a mistake. His own workshop began to feel unfamiliar. Clocks ticked out of rhythm. Tools moved from one place to another without him touching them. He found sketches he didn't remember drawing, notes written in his own handwriting but with ideas he had never had. He looked in the mirror and saw his reflection blink before he did. The walls seemed to breathe. The air felt thick. Emile knew he was no longer living in one timeline. He was drifting between many, each shaped by a different turn of the dial. He tried to map the changes, writing down each use of the retronic and the effects that followed. But the notes didn't help. They changed too. One day, a page would say one thing, and the next day, it would say something else. Emile realized that even his memory was no longer safe. He couldn't trust what he saw, what he felt, or what he remembered. Time had become a mirror with cracks running through it, and each crack showed a different version of the world. Emile stopped sleeping. He stayed in the workshop, watching the clocks, listening to the ticking, trying to find a pattern. But there was no pattern. Only noise. Only confusion. He understood now that time was not a straight line. It was a living thing, a web of moments connected by choices. And every time he had used the retronic, he had pulled on that web, tearing it a little more. The device had not just changed the past, it had changed the nature of reality itself. He looked at the retronic and felt fear. It was small, quiet, and beautiful, but it held too much power. Emile had wanted control, but he had lost it. He had wanted to fix his life, but he had broken the world. He didn't know how to stop the chain reaction. He didn't know if it could be stopped. But he knew one thing. He could no longer trust time. And time, it seemed, could no longer trust him. Chapter 5. The Last Chance. Emile Brenner stood in the center of his workshop, surrounded by clocks that ticked in uneven rhythms. The air felt heavy, and the light from the windows seemed dimmer than usual. He hadn't slept in days. His face was pale, and his hands trembled slightly as he held the retronic. The device looked the same as always, small, polished, and quiet. But Emile knew it was no longer just a machine. It had become something else, something deeper. He had built it to fix small mistakes, but now it had changed the world around him. Time was no longer stable. Reality felt thin, like paper stretched too far. Emile had tried to control it, but now he understood that he had only disturbed it. He looked at the retronic and felt a mix of fear and regret. He had used it too many times, each turn of the dial creating new versions of events, new paths that twisted and tangled. People in town were confused. Some remembered things that never happened. Others forgot important moments. Emile had seen objects move without being touched, and shadows that didn't match the light. He had even found sketches in his notebook that he didn't remember drawing. The device had reached beyond him. It had touched the fabric of time itself. Emile decided there was only one thing left to do. He would destroy the retronic. He believed that if he could break it, maybe time would heal. Maybe the world would return to normal. He picked up a heavy hammer from his workbench and held it above the device. His heart pounded. He hesitated, then brought the hammer down. But before it touched the retronic, the device vanished. It didn't break. It didn't fall. It simply disappeared, as if it had never been there. Emile stared at the empty table, stunned. He searched the room, checked drawers, looked under shelves. Nothing. The Retronic was gone. He sat down slowly, trying to understand. The device had stopped obeying him. It had become part of something larger. It was no longer just a tool, it was part of time itself. Emil realized he couldn't destroy it. He couldn't control it. But maybe he could still make one final change. He thought about the first day he had used the Retronic. That moment had started everything. If he could return to that day and choose not to activate it, maybe the chain of events would never begin. Maybe time would stay whole. He stood up and walked to the center of the room. He closed his eyes and focused. He imagined the moment clearly, the position of the sun, the sound of the clocks, the feeling in his hands. Then, as if answering his thoughts, the Retronic reappeared on the table. Emil didn't question it. He picked it up, turned the dial one last time, and felt the familiar pull. The room spun, the light shifted, and the ticking of the clocks faded. When he opened his eyes, he was back in his workshop, one day before he had first used the Retronic. Everything looked normal. The clocks ticked in harmony. The air was calm. The device sat quietly on the table, untouched. Emil walked to his safe, opened it, and placed the Retronic inside. He locked the door and put the key away. He didn't speak. He didn't write. He simply decided to leave it there, forever. From that day forward, Emil lived as a simple watchmaker again. He repaired clocks, greeted customers, and walked through the city without fear. But sometimes, late at night, he heard a ticking sound that didn't match any of his machines. It was soft, distant, and familiar. He knew it was the Retronic, still waiting, still watching. And he wondered if another version of himself, in another thread of time, was still using it. Emil had learned something important. Time was not a tool. It was not a thing to be shaped or fixed. It was a living force, full of mystery and balance. He had tried to change it, and it had changed him. Now, he chose silence. He chose peace. And he hoped that was enough. Chapter 6. The Rewind. Emil Brenner stood in the quiet of his workshop, holding the Retronic in his hand for what he knew would be the last time. The brass casing felt warm, as if it had absorbed the energy of every moment it had changed. The ticking inside was soft but steady, like a heartbeat that didn't belong to him. Emil's face was tired, his eyes shadowed by sleepless nights and the weight of too many choices. He had seen the world twist and bend under the pressure of his invention. He had watched reality shift in ways no one else could see. And now, he was ready to let it go. He closed his eyes and turned the dial. The familiar pull of the Retronic wrapped around him like a wave. The room spun, the air thickened, and the sound of clocks faded into silence. When he opened his eyes, he was back in his workshop, one day before he had first used the device. Everything looked normal. The light through the windows was soft and golden. The clocks ticked in perfect rhythm. The tools on his bench were clean and untouched. It was as if nothing had ever happened. Emil didn't hesitate. He walked to the heavy iron safe in the corner of the room, opened it, and placed the Retronic inside. He locked the door and slid the key into a drawer he rarely used. He didn't write a note. He didn't mark the date. He simply closed the drawer and stepped away. The device was out of reach now, and he promised himself he would never touch it again. He had learned that time was not something to control. It was something to respect. He returned to his work as a watchmaker. He repaired clocks, polished gears, and greeted customers with quiet kindness. He no longer tried to fix the past. He focused on the present, on the small details that made each day feel real. People in town noticed a change in him. He seemed calmer, more grounded. He didn't speak of the Retronic, and no one asked. The world moved forward, and Emile led it. But sometimes, late at night, when the workshop was silent and the city outside was asleep, Emile heard a ticking sound that didn't match any of his clocks. It was faint, almost hidden, but it was there. He would stop what he was doing and listen. The sound came from nowhere and everywhere. It reminded him of the Retronic, of the moments he had changed, of the versions of himself that might still exist in other threads of time. He also felt something else, a presence. It was not frightening, but it was strange. He felt watched, not by another person, but by another version of himself. A version that had made different choices, walked different paths, and lived in a reality shaped by other turns of the dial. Emile didn't try to explain it. He accepted it as part of the cost. Time had many layers, and he had touched more than one. He continued his life with quiet purpose. He built clocks that ticked with precision and care. He taught a young apprentice how to listen to the rhythm of gears and springs. He never spoke of the Retronic, but he never forgot it. It remained locked away, untouched, but never truly gone. Emile knew that time remembered everything. And even if he had stepped away from the device, its echo would always be part of him. In the end, Emile found peace not by changing time, but by choosing to live within it. He understood that every moment mattered, and that trying to fix the past could break the future. The ticking he heard in the silence was not a warning, it was a reminder. A reminder that time was alive, and that it had allowed him to return. He had been given a second chance, not to change the world, but to understand it. And that, he believed, was enough. Chapter 7. Echoes. Years passed slowly for Emile Brenner. His life became quiet again, just as it had been before the Retronic. He spent his days repairing clocks, polishing brass, and adjusting gears with careful hands. The workshop returned to its old rhythm, filled with the soft ticking of timepieces and the smell of oil and wood. Emile no longer searched for answers. He no longer tried to change anything. He had locked the Retronic away and never touched it again. But even though he had stopped using the device, time had not forgotten. Strange things began to happen, small at first, then harder to ignore. People came into the shop and spoke to Emile about moments he didn't remember. One man thanked him for fixing a watch that Emile had never seen before. A woman asked about a clock she claimed he had built for her wedding, but Emile had no memory of it. He checked his records, looked through his drawers, and found nothing. Yet the people were certain. They described the clocks in detail, even the way Emile had smiled while handing them over. Emile listened politely, but inside he felt uneasy. One afternoon, a boy entered the shop carrying a small clock. It was made of dark wood and had a silver dial with symbols Emile had never used. The boy said it was a gift from his grandfather, who had bought it from Emile many years ago. Emile examined the clock. It was built in his style, with familiar parts and careful craftsmanship. But he had no memory of making it. He turned it over and saw his initials carved into the base. His hands had touched it, but not in this version of time. Emile understood then that the echoes of his past changes were still alive. He began to notice other signs. Sometimes, he would find tools moved from their usual places. A sketch would appear on his desk, drawn in his own hand but with ideas he didn't remember having. He saw people in the street who looked familiar, but he couldn't place them. He heard conversations that felt like memories from another life. Emile didn't speak of these things. He kept them to himself, writing short notes in a private journal. He didn't try to explain them. He simply accepted that time had layers, and he had touched more than one. At night, when the city was quiet and the workshop was dark, Emile would sit alone and listen. The clocks ticked softly, but sometimes he heard a different sound. It was faint, like a whisper, coming from the corners of the room. It reminded him of the Retronic, of the moments he had changed, of the versions of himself that had walked other paths. He felt watched, not by someone else, but by another Emile, one who had made different choices, lived in different timelines, and still existed somewhere in the folds of time. Emile didn't fear these echoes. He saw them as reminders. They showed him that time was not simple. It was not a straight road. It was a field of possibilities, shaped by every decision, every action, every turn of the dial. He had tried to control it, and he had learned that control was an illusion. Now, he chose to live with the mystery. He focused on the present, on the small details that made each day real. He taught his apprentice to listen to the rhythm of the gears, to respect the balance of time. The Retronic remained locked in the safe, untouched but never forgotten. Emile knew it was still there, waiting. But he also knew that he would never use it again. He had learned that some mistakes must stay as they are. Some regrets must be lived with. And some questions must remain unanswered. Time had given him a second chance, not to change the past, but to understand it. And that understanding became his peace. Emile Brenner continued his work, quietly and carefully. The world around him moved forward, but the echoes remained. They whispered through the ticking of the clocks, through the memories of strangers, through the shadows of forgotten choices. Emile listened, and he smiled. He had learned that time remembers everything. And sometimes it speaks. Chapter 8. The Legacy. In the final years of his life, Emile Brenner lived in quiet solitude. His hair had turned gray, and his hands, once steady and precise, had grown slower with age. But his mind remained sharp, and his thoughts often returned to the Retronic. Though he had locked it away long ago, he still felt its presence. It was not just a machine anymore, it was a memory, a lesson, and a warning. Emile had spent years trying to forget the weight of what he had done, but time, like the ticking of his clocks, never truly stopped. It only moved forward, carrying echoes of the past with it. As his health began to fade, Emile knew he had one last task to complete. He sat at his desk, lit a small oil lamp, and took out a sheet of paper. With slow, careful strokes, he began to write a letter. It was not long, but every word carried meaning. He wrote about the Retronic, how he had built it with hope, how he had used it with fear, and how he had learned that time was not something to control. He explained that each use of the device had changed more than just a moment. It had changed people, places, and even the shape of reality itself. He wrote about the strange events, the broken memories, and the feeling of being watched by versions of himself that no longer existed. He did not try to hide his mistakes. He admitted that he had been wrong to think he could fix the past without consequences. He had wanted to erase pain, to undo regret, but he had only created more confusion. Time, he wrote, is not a tool. It is a living force, full of balance and mystery. It remembers everything. It forgives nothing. And it always finds a way to restore itself, even if it means letting go of the people who tried to change it. At the end of the letter, Emile left a simple request. He asked that whoever found the Retronic should not use it. He warned that the desire to change the past is strong, but it is also dangerous. He knew that his words might not be enough. He knew that someone, someday, would open the safe, read the letter, and still turn the dial. Because that is what people do. They hope. They regret. They reach for second chances, even when they know the cost. When the letter was finished, Emile folded it neatly and placed it inside the safe next to the Retronic. He closed the door, turned the key, and placed it in a drawer. Then he sat back in his chair and listened to the ticking of the clocks around him. It was a sound he had known all his life. It was the sound of time moving forward, steady and unchanging. He closed his eyes and let it carry him. After Emile's death, the workshop remained untouched for many years. Dust settled on the shelves, and the clocks slowly stopped ticking. But the safe remained locked, waiting. One day, someone would open it. Someone would find the letter. And someone would face the same choice Emile had faced. To use the Retronic, or to leave it in silence. Emile's legacy was not just the device he built. It was the story he left behind. A story about invention, regret, and the limits of control. A story that reminded others that time is not a puzzle to be solved, but a path to be walked. Every choice we make closes the door to other paths. Every step forward is also a farewell to what could have been. And sometimes, the wish to fix everything leads to greater mistakes. The Retronic remained in the safe, quiet and still. But its presence was never truly gone. It lived in the letter, in the memories of those who knew Emile, and in the ticking of every clock that still carried his touch. Time had not forgotten. And neither had he. Moral. Sometimes the desire to fix the past leads to deeper mistakes. Time is not a tool, it is a living force that remembers every choice. Trying to control it can break more than it heals. True wisdom is not in changing what was, but in accepting it, learning from it, and moving forward with care. Every decision we make closes the door to countless other paths. And in that silence, we find the meaning of time, not in perfection, but in presence. Thank you for your attention. If you like the story, please like and subscribe. It motivates us to make new videos and helps us promote the channel. Thank you.